Imagine a hunger so deep, so painful, that the leather belt holding your sword starts to look appetizing, not as a joke, not as a metaphor, but as genuine food. What you see here isn't dinner, it is desperation. When the grain stores ran dry, medieval defenders didn't just surrender, they improvised. First, they ate the warhorses, then the hunting dogs, then the rats. And when the rats were gone, they boiled the leather from their saddles, boots, and shields, trying to trick their stomachs with a thick glue soup. Welcome to the reality of siege warfare. We love to talk about the cavalry charges of Agincourt or the strategies of Alexander the Great. But the brutal truth is that most wars in history weren't won by the sword. They were won by starvation. Today we forget the glory. We are going inside the locked walls to see what actually happens when 2,000 people are trapped for 6 months without food. We will talk about disease, the expulsion of useless mouths, and the ultimate taboo, survival cannibalism. This is the hell of a medieval siege. This was the reality inside a besieged castle when the grain ran out and desperation took hold. Medieval defenders did not simply surrender when starvation arrived at their gates. They improvised with a creativity born of absolute terror. First, they slaughtered the warhorses, those magnificent beasts worth more than most peasants earned in a lifetime. Then came the hunting dogs, loyal companions reduced to meat. Then the rats, chased through corridors and fought over like treasures. And when even the rats were gone, they boiled the leather from their saddles, boots, and shields, creating a thick glue soup that filled the stomach but provided almost nothing to sustain life. The siege was the most common form of medieval warfare, and it was designed not to defeat an enemy in battle, but to starve them into submission. For every dramatic assault on castle walls, there were dozens of sieges where the attackers simply surrounded the fortress and waited. Waited for the food to run out, waited for disease to spread, waited for the defenders to eat everything that could possibly be eaten, and then to start eating the unthinkable. A siege was a mathematical equation of death, cold, and precise. The commander inside the castle faced a simple calculation that would determine whether his people lived or died. How many mouths did he have to feed? And how many days of grain remained in the stores? When the enemy army surrounded the walls and cut off all supply routes, a clock began ticking that could not be stopped. Every meal consumed brought the garrison one step closer to starvation. Every day that passed without relief from outside forces was another day subtracted from survival. The commander had to balance military necessity against humanitarian concern, and in medieval warfare, military necessity almost always won. The mathematics of siege warfare had no room for sentiment or mercy. In the first weeks of a siege, life inside the castle continued with relative normalcy. Rationing was implemented but remained light, more an inconvenience than a hardship. The defenders maintained hope that a relief force would arrive, that the attackers would grow bored and withdraw, that something would change the equation in their favor. But as weeks stretched into months and no salvation appeared on the horizon, the psychological weight of confinement began to crush spirits as surely as hunger crushed bodies. The castle that had once represented safety became a prison. The walls that protected against enemy swords now prevented escape from slow starvation. Hope faded with each passing day, replaced by the grim knowledge that the worst was yet to come. The descent into starvation followed a predictable pattern that historians call the Starvation Ladder, a grim progression from normalcy to absolute horror. The first step was always the same: slaughter the animals that required grain to survive. Pigs and cattle were killed immediately, their meat salted and preserved, their feed redirected to human mouths. This was sensible resource management, painful but logical. The garrison traded future productivity for immediate survival, converting livestock into preserved rations that would extend the siege by precious weeks. But this first step, however rational, marked the beginning of a descent from which there was no return. Once the livestock was gone, the siege entered its darkest phases. The next step on the Starvation Ladder was a military tragedy that broke the hearts of knights throughout the medieval world. The warhorses had to die. To a knight, his destrier was far more than simple transportation. It was his status symbol, his primary weapon, his companion through years of training and warfare. A fully trained warhorse cost as much as a small estate and took years to develop the temperament for battle. Killing such an animal was like destroying a modern tank, an irreplaceable military asset sacrificed for a few weeks of food. But when the garrison is starving and the children are crying from hunger, a horse is simply 1,000 pounds of meat. Records from the siege of Rochester in 1215 show that the knights defending the castle held out until they had consumed their very last expensive warhorse, weeping as they ate their companions. Once the horses were gone, the social taboos that normally governed human behavior began to crumble. Dogs were next, those loyal creatures that had guarded the castle and hunted alongside their masters. Then cats, valued for keeping rats away from grain stores but now more valuable as food themselves. Even birds captured on the battlements became precious sources of protein. During the siege of Paris in 1590, the situation deteriorated so severely that people hunted rats through the streets with the desperation of men chasing deer. A rat, normally a symbol of filth and disease, became a luxury item sold on the black market for prices that would have been absurd just months before. The social order inverted completely, with the lowest creatures becoming the most valuable, and human dignity stripped away one meal at a time. But what happens when even the rats are gone? This is where the horror of siege warfare truly reveals itself, where human desperation crosses boundaries that should never be crossed. The stomach is a demanding organ that will not be ignored. It cramps, it aches, it screams with a pain that consumes all thought. To silence this internal torment, starving soldiers turned to substances that no sane person would consider food. Historical chronicles from the Hundred Years' War describe men soaking their leather shields and boots in water for days, softening the treated animal hide until it could be chewed and swallowed. Leather has almost no nutritional value, but it fills the void in your stomach and gives your jaw something to do besides clench in hunger. The consumption of the inedible became systematic as siege conditions worsened. Soldiers ate tallow candles made from animal fat, gnawing on waxy lumps that provided minimal calories, but at least contained some form of sustenance. They ate parchment made from sheepskin, documents and records consumed as food rather than preserved as history. At the siege of Chateau Gaillard, chroniclers recorded that defenders ate grass growing between the cobblestones, crawling on hands and knees to harvest every green blade from the castle courtyard. They drank water mixed with vinegar to kill the taste of contamination and rot. They were literally eating the castle itself, consuming everything that could conceivably provide any form of nourishment, desperate to survive one more day in hopes that tomorrow would bring relief. If eating leather sounds horrific, the next tactic employed in siege warfare was purely demonic in its cold calculation. Military historians know it as the expulsion of the useless mouths, a phrase that reduces human beings to their consumption of resources. Castle commanders looked at the people under their protection and divided them into two categories with brutal efficiency. There were those who could fight, who could hold a sword and stand on the walls and contribute to the defense. And there were those who could only eat, who consumed precious food without providing any military value in return. Women, children, the elderly, the sick, the wounded. In the merciless logic of siege warfare, these people were not victims to be protected. They were liabilities to be eliminated. The order to expel civilians from a besieged castle was among the most terrible commands a medieval commander could give. Gates that had been sealed against the enemy were opened just long enough to push out hundreds of terrified people. Families separated, children torn from parents, the weak cast into the no-man's land between the walls and the besieging army. The commander justified this horror with mathematics. Every civilian expelled meant more food for the soldiers who defended the walls, more days the garrison could hold out, a greater chance that relief would arrive in time. But those expelled faced a fate that made remaining inside the starving castle seem merciful. They were caught between two forces that both wanted them dead, and neither would show them any compassion. The tragedy of the expelled civilians reached its most infamous expression at Chateau Gaillard in 1204. King Philip of France was besieging this mighty English fortress, and the English commander, faced with dwindling supplies, made the decision to cast out the useless mouths. Hundreds of civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly, were pushed through the castle gates into the winter cold. But King Philip refused to let them pass through his lines. If the French allowed these civilians to leave, the food inside the castle would last longer, extending the siege and costing French lives. So the French pushed the civilians back toward the castle walls, and the English refused to let them return inside. Hundreds of innocent people were trapped in the dry moat between the locked castle gates and the French siege lines. For months, these expelled civilians lived in the freezing mud of the moat, slowly starving to death while their husbands and fathers watched helplessly from the walls above. They had no shelter from the winter rain and snow. They had no food except what they could scavenge from frozen ground. They huddled together for warmth and died one by one, their bodies too weak to bury their dead companions. Contemporary accounts describe the moat filling with corpses, the living too exhausted to move away from the dead. It was a slow, agonizing execution, weaponized by both sides of the conflict, with each army using civilian suffering as a tool against the other. The expulsion of useless mouths was not merely cruel, it was cruelty elevated to military strategy. Even if hunger did not kill you inside a besieged castle, the filth almost certainly would. A castle is a closed system, a sealed environment with finite resources, and no way to remove waste. With thousands of people and animals trapped inside the walls, sanitation collapsed within weeks of a siege beginning. The latrines overflowed with human waste. Bodies of the dead could not be buried deeply enough in ground already filled with foundations and previous burials. The water supply, drawn from wells within the castle, became contaminated with seepage from mass graves and overflowing cesspits. The air itself grew thick with the stench of decay and human misery, a miasma that medieval people believed carried disease directly into the lungs. Dysentery, known to medieval soldiers as the bloody flux, killed more people in siege warfare than enemy arrows ever did. The disease spread through contaminated water and food, attacking the digestive system with devastating efficiency. Victims suffered constant bloody diarrhea that dehydrated them rapidly, draining their strength and their will to live. In the confined spaces of a besieged castle, with no clean water available and no medicine to fight the infection, dysentery spread from person to person until entire garrisons were too weak to stand on the walls. Men died in pools of their own waste, their bodies adding to the contamination that would kill their surviving companions. The bloody flux was a weapon more terrible than any siege engine. The besieging armies knew about disease and learned to weaponize it deliberately. Before the invention of gunpowder, biological warfare was often the most effective way to break a siege without costly assaults on the walls. Attacking armies loaded their trebuchets not with stones designed to smash fortifications, but with the bloated corpses of dead horses or soldiers who had died of plague. These biological missiles were launched over the castle walls, shattering on impact and spreading bacteria, decay, and the overwhelming stench of death throughout the fortress. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical contamination. Defenders could not escape the rotting bodies landing among them, could not clean the filth from their living spaces, could not avoid breathing air thick with the smell of decomposition. The most infamous example of medieval biological warfare occurred at the Siege of Kaffa in 1346. The Mongol army besieging this trading city on the Black Sea coast suffered an outbreak of plague within their own ranks. Rather than retreat, the Mongol commanders turned their disaster into a weapon. They loaded plague-ridden corpses onto their siege engines and catapulted them over the city walls. The plague spread through Kaffa like wildfire, killing defenders who had survived months of conventional siege warfare. When the city finally fell, merchants fled by ship, carrying the disease with them across the Mediterranean. Many historians believe this deliberate act of biological warfare helped jumpstart the Black Death, the pandemic that would kill one-third of Europe's population. A single siege contributed to the deadliest outbreak in human history. We have reached the bottom of the starvation ladder, the final step that represents the complete collapse of human civilization. The horses have been eaten, their bones cracked for marrow. The leather has been boiled until it dissolved. The grass has been stripped from every crack between every stone. The children and elderly have been expelled to die in the moat. Disease has claimed half the garrison. What remains when every possible source of food has been exhausted? The survivors look at the bodies of the dead with a new and terrible perspective, seeing not former companions, but potential sustenance. Cannibalism is the darkest secret of siege warfare, the ultimate taboo that even medieval chroniclers hesitated to record. The evidence for survival cannibalism during sieges appears throughout medieval records, written with shame and horror by witnesses who could barely bring themselves to describe what they had seen. During the First Crusade at the Siege of Mara in 1098, contemporary chronicles suggest that starving crusaders consumed the flesh of dead Saracen defenders. The chroniclers tried to justify this horror by claiming the victims were enemies and infidels. But the reality was simpler and more terrible. Starving men will eat anything to survive, and religious justification was merely a way to live with the memory afterward. The crusaders who survived Mara carried the psychological scars of what they had done for the rest of their lives. The siege of Suyang in China during the 8th century represents perhaps the darkest chapter in the history of siege warfare. The Tang dynasty general Zhang Shun held the city against rebel forces for months, his garrison slowly starving as supplies ran out. When the conventional food sources were exhausted, Zhang Shun made a decision that would haunt Chinese history. He began systematically distributing the civilian population as food for his soldiers. Contemporary accounts record that over 20,000 people were consumed during the siege, their bodies butchered and distributed like rations. Zhang Shun reportedly began with his own concubine, demonstrating to his men that he would ask nothing of them that he would not do himself. The city held, the rebellion was eventually defeated, but the cost was measured in human flesh. Survival cannibalism represents the point where humanity breaks entirely, where thousands of years of civilization and moral development are erased by the simple biological need to survive. The instincts that kept our prehistoric ancestors alive override every social taboo, every religious prohibition, every bond of friendship or family. In the dark, freezing cold of a castle dungeon, a dead companion stops being a person with a name and a history. He becomes meat. The survivors who crossed this line rarely spoke of it afterward, carrying their secret to the grave. But the evidence remains in chronicles and court records, testimony to the depths to which siege warfare could drive otherwise ordinary people. When the gates of a besieged castle finally opened, whether through surrender or successful assault, the victorious army rarely found an opposing force ready to fight. They found skeletons, living ghosts with hollow eyes and skin stretched over visible bones, men too weak to lift the swords they had once wielded with pride. The castle interiors told the story of the siege in grim detail. Piles of bones from consumed animals, strips of leather with tooth marks, the overwhelming stench of human waste and decomposition. The victors often recoiled in horror at what they found, unable to comprehend how the defenders had survived as long as they did. The answer, of course, was that most of them had not survived at all. We romanticize the Middle Ages in our popular culture, filling movies and television with images of shining armor and banners waving in the wind, noble knights fighting honorable battles on sunlit fields. But the reality of medieval warfare was not found in cavalry charges or single combat between champions. It was found in the dark, quiet horror of a siege, in the slow starvation that reduced proud warriors to desperate animals, in the impossible choices that forced commanders to sacrifice civilians or watch their garrisons die. The siege was not glorious. It was not romantic. It was a grinding machine designed to break human beings through hunger, disease, and despair. The psychological trauma of siege warfare extended far beyond the physical suffering. Survivors carried memories that could never be erased, images of children expelled to die in moats, of companions consumed when the food ran out, of the moment when they themselves crossed lines they never imagined crossing. Medieval society had no concept of post-traumatic stress, no treatment for the invisible wounds that siege survivors carried. They returned to their families and communities as changed people, haunted by experiences they could never share, marked forever by what they had endured and what they had done to endure it. The siege killed some people quickly and others slowly, over years of nightmares and guilt. The castle, that iconic symbol of medieval power and romance, was designed primarily for one purpose: to survive a siege. Every architectural feature, From the thick walls to the deep wells to the massive storerooms, existed to extend the time a garrison could hold out against encirclement. Builders calculated how many months of grain the cellars could hold. Engineers designed water systems that could not be poisoned from outside. Architects created murder holes and arrow slits that would allow defenders to kill attackers while consuming minimal energy. The castle was a machine for surviving starvation, and its beauty masks its brutal purpose. When we admire a medieval fortress, we are admiring a monument to the expectation of horror.
So the next time you see a majestic castle standing on a hill, its towers reaching toward the sky, and its walls glowing golden in the sunset, do not merely admire the stone and the engineering. Remember the cost of holding those walls against a determined enemy. Remember the leather broth that filled stomachs without nourishing bodies. Remember the useless mouths expelled to die between the armies. Remember the plague corpses launched over the battlements. Remember the final, unspeakable meals that kept the last defenders alive long enough to surrender. Remember that sometimes, in the mathematics of siege warfare, the sword was a mercy compared to the slow death that awaited those who held out too long. The medieval siege was worse than hell, because hell at least offered the certainty of death. The siege offered only the uncertainty of survival and the price that survival demanded.